Hello friends, welcome back to this session. In this session, we are going to understand the API, what is API, how API works, types of API, how we can make the secure of the API, and we'll also understand how to test the API. So let's start. Let's not waste much time, and let's go the next slide. So the first question is what is API? So API basically it's a mechanism that enable two software component which can communicate with each other using the set of definition and the protocol. So basically it's giving a way where two software or application can communication within the standard protocol. For example, uh, if you see the weather bureau software that basically contains the weather data, and your mobile app which basically taking the latest updates from the weather, so that's basically communicate through the weather app software APIs. So the server will create an API which having the standard protocol which can take the client request in this particular set of the definition of function. So that will basically communicate between the two client and server. So this all about what is API. Let's try to understand how what does API stand for. So API stand for application programming interface. In the context of API, the word application refer to any software which basically distinct the function. So basically API it's a application programming interface which giving the interface where a client and server can communicate between two interface which having the standard protocol. Interface can be through of contract service between the two application. That means they have some specific contract can communicate between the two software. This contract define how to communicate two communication with each other using the request and response. So that is the same. It should have the some common documentation between the client and server. So on what protocol they are communicating and how they will take the request and how the server will give the response. This is the API communication protocol. So how API is works? So API architecture usually explained in terms of the client and server, what we have discussed. The application sending the request called the client. So the who is actually asking the data. So sending the request, it's a client, and the application sending the response is called the server. So in the weather example, the Bureau of Weather database server is a main server of the response which give the weather update, and the mobile app is basically taking requesting the data from the weather server, and it's taking the response and it populating to the customer. So that is actually here the client. So here the example of how API is works. So here the mobile application draws and it give the request to the API. API will take that request and pass to the server, that is a backend server, and the server will give the response to the API, and API will give the response to back to the mobile application. So in your mobile application you see the updates. So in the layman language, the example, if you see, user is basically check the menu in the restaurant and will give the order to the waiter, and waiter take that order and pass to the kitchen. Kitchen will the process that order and give back to the waiter, and waiter will deliver to you on the table. So here the what processing happening inside the kitchen that you don't know, what kind of mixing they are doing that you don't know, but what you know, you have requested in the format of the menu and you get the output as a food on your table. So this is the request and response from the user to the server. Similar way, mobile application will communication to works with the server of the weather data. So what type of APIs? So there are four type of API. So SOAP API, the API basically use the simple object access protocol. This is the SOAP API. Client and server basically exchange messaging using the XML in the SOAP API. This is the less flexible API that was more popular in the past. So this is the SOAP API, not using the much nowadays. RPC API. So RPC API, this API called the remote procedure call. The client complete a function on the server and server send output back to the client. So that's a RPC API. The next API is the WebSocket API. WebSocket API is another modern web API that basically use the JSON object to pass the data. A WebSocket API supports two-way communication between the client app and the server. The server can send callback message to the connected client. So here WebSocket API where normally client also take the request, but here in the WebSocket API server also can take that callback request from the client. So it basically making the more efficient than the REST API. So next is the REST API. These are the most popular and flexible API found on the web today. The client send the request to the server as a data. Server use the client input to start the internal function and return output as a data here. Let's look the API in the more details. So the how API integration works. So API integration are the software component that automatically update data between the client and server. So that's how API integration works. Some example of API integration are the when automatically data sync up. So how our mobile phone and laptops, that's data sync up, works from the API. Second one is the your gallery, photo gallery, that is actually syncing the with the server, like how Google Photos are working. So that works both level where data upload and request comes from your server. So enterprise can also use them to the efficiently automatic many system to function. That means in an organization many antivirus update and some organization policy they are pushing from the server also. So that is also integration from the server to client. So that is also works from the integration level. So how to make the REST API secure? So there is a two-way authentication token and API keys. So authentication token basically used to authorize the user to make an API call. Authentication token check that user are who actually claim to that basically having the right access or not. For example, when you log in into email server, your email client use the authentication token to secure the access. API keys. API keys basically verify the program or application making the API call. They identify the applications and ensure that access right having the right access or not. So making the API call, it will validate that API keys. API keys are not as secure as the token, but they allow API monitoring in order to gather the data uses. That is also important part. It helps in the monitoring part. You may have the notice the long string character in your browser URL when you visit the different website. So that string is the API key website use the make their internal API call. So how API testing should work? So that is also important part. So basically when you do any testing, you should focus the fundamental of the functional testing. So making the multiple requests to API endpoint for the performance testing, that's a performance testing. Writing unit tests and checking the business logic and functional correctness, that's a functional testing. And security testing by the simulating the system attack, so that's a security testing. So here the three main component explained, that is the performance testing. So performance you have to validate with the multiple requests, you have to validate with how your server can handle the capacity of request multiple, so that you have to make that validation. Second one is the logical validation, that's a functional testing. You should check what actually API desired to create it, so actually it's fulfilling the right logic or not, that you have to validate. The third one is the security testing. Security testing is a more important, where you have to check with the different security protocols. You should focus on the OAuth top 10 and OAuth other vulnerabilities. So you should check how the other tools can helpful to here to validate the security testing. You should use some of the common protocols, some common tools used for the security. DDoS is also important here because that is a common attacks for the security. When you have get the multiple requests from the multiple server, you should know how to make that secure that particular API server. For example, if you get the multiple requests from the same IP, you should block. So that basically comes in the DDoS attack. So there are multiple software and configuration are available where you should use protocol blocking particular DDoS attack. The next level, you should use the authentication key and the token key validation part. The next one is you should check that server having the right updated plugins, right updated softwares. For example, HTTPS, HTTP, what protocol you are using, what SSL certificate you are using, that you have to check in the security testing. So this all about what is API, how API works, what type of API, and how we should test the API. We'll meet in the next session. Please be in touch and let us know if you need any specific topic. We'll try to make that. Thank you.
If you have any question or any doubt, feel free to ask in the comment section below. I will answer you as soon as I can. Thank you for watching. Bye and have a nice day.